the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 85, Godflesh.
That was Godhead from Godflesh here on the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And tonight the reins have sort of been, I guess, handed over to me a little bit, even though Mark is familiar with certain tidbits here.
I'm pretty familiar with Streetcleaner, and that's really about the only thing that kind of like
I hung on to.
Yeah.
Just that record is unbelievable. I mean, Like Rats is kind of like if you haven't heard that song, you haven't lived.
we'll be listening to Like Rats in a moment. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty ultimate expression of sort of apocalyptic hate or something, like industrial, destruction, if you will. The tune we just heard, Godhead, and we'll kind of get into the backstory of Godflesh a little bit. Comes from the first EP, which was Swordfish Records actually put out like 3 different vinyl versions of it, and then that's what got them signed to Earache Records, and then Earache has since re-released it with some bonus tracks and different things. But I guess the thing you can say about Godflesh sound-wise, what you heard in that song, is the sort of lifeless kind of post-apocalyptic kind of energy, I guess, to the music.
Or lack of.
Yeah, it's devoid of energy. Is another thing I sort of wrote down. It's very plodding. The drum machine, which was such an interesting, I guess, choice that Jess and Broadrick, sort of decided to rely on the drum machine, gives it kind of like that mechanical, like lifeless. I don't know. It sounds like it's. The drums are so minimal, but then they're almost like cranked, to 11, to where the really like kind of simplistic beats that are in some, like in a lot of these old drum machines, they sound that much more they like servo it like almost a machine working, Yeah, absolutely. And then of course the radical thing that Godflesh does sound wise as well as the drum machine is the way that they use the bass. Mm-hmm. I mean, the bass and the resonating. I mean, it almost becomes. I don't even really know how to describe it, but it just the bass becomes almost like the lead instrument in a certain sense, but it's so distorted and all over the music in a sense that it sort of is crushing. It's not like normal rhythmic bass that you're sort of used to hearing in most metal songs.
Yeah, the bass and the drums almost kind of like in traditional band structure. I guess that's leading us forward, but then the guitar is the stuff that's doing just all the accents.
Yeah,
but there's not like riffs.
No, I mean there's sort of like these kind of notes that are just kind of like swimming in the background of a lot of the music and stuff like that.
I mean, Godflesh is kind of known for being like one of the loudest bands ever. Like if anybody's seen the Hard and Heavy
the grindcore special, grindcore thing,
Justin Broderick's talking in there about how like women have orgasmed in the crowd from the
just
volume,
the bass
volume.
Well, I think also I remember when I saw Godflesh.
You can feel in your chest
at the shelter, down in the basement of the shelter in Detroit, and it was an odd pairing. It was Godflesh and Earth Crisis, but what are you going to do? You're right. You can just feel the rumbling in your gut, and it just sort of tears you apart. And the only thing I can think of that I've seen like that was when we saw Warhorse and Electric Wizard. And that just like that bass sort of grabbed you. And I would say that Godflesh was probably an influence on bands like Warhorse for sure.
I'm sure sonically,
yeah, and that the whole Southern Lord kind of aesthetic, in a way of the minimalistic but yet like crushing doom.
Yeah, and then the other
Godflesh
side of that, the whole Hydra head.
Yeah,
the whole avant rock metal kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so you hear those elements on a tune like Godhead, which is just sort of there's not anything that jumps out from the first record per se as like a song like say like Rats, which Mark mentioned earlier and we'll be playing next. Avalanche Master song, Spinebender. I mean they all have like their unique qualities to them, but there's not like a single, I don't think people like
it's like trying to pull a single out of a soundtrack.
Yeah,
kind of almost.
Yeah, it just sort of works as like a piece of music and stuff. And again, they're just trying to get their craft down, I think, in this early stage. And obviously, in terms of background information, I mean, Justin Broadrick, of course, is still, doing music today. He's doing lots and lots of remixes and, has done remixes for like ISIS and all kinds of different bands. He's in a band called Grey Machine, which just put out a record recently. And of course,
Napalm.
He's most well known from his roots in Napalm. And then, of course, the band he currently has, which is Jesu, today.
Yeah, and then he was in Head of David for a while after Napalm as well.
And what's initially happened is he plays on side A or side B of Scum. I'm trying to remember.
I think side A.
Yeah, so he's on the tune Scum. Is Justin playing guitar, and I think at the time he was 14, 15. something like that.
Everybody's pretty young.
I mean, but I think he was the youngest of the whole band, and so he kind of comes out of the
because I think Steer's on side too, isn't he?
Yeah, I think Bill Steer from Carcass is on side too, and so Broadrick, of course, develops this reputation early on for being in one of the most important records in sort of extreme metal history, and then leaves right away. He and Ben Green, who you heard playing the bass on this record, also known as C.G. Green on a lot of the
Love the Beach
records.
Boys. Loves the Beach Boys. Which I can see that.
C. Christian Green. Oh, sure. It's all there. The sort. Well, I think some of the aesthetic
production
of like Brian Wilson and some of the stuff that you hear on
Sonic
Pet Sounds and Smile and things like that. Yeah. I mean, I could see Broadrick being really into that stuff as well. But they actually formed after they quit Napalm. I think even before they joined up with Headed David, they had a band called Follow Because. And Follow Because was sort of just a side project as Broadrick was sort of full-time with Headed David for a while, which is another industrial metal band, I guess, of the late 80s. Kind of like Killing
really,
Joke or
kind of
Prom
hard to categorize.
Or, some of that kind of stuff. And apparently what happened is the Headed David guys got really as I read, I guess they start talking a lot about Whitesnake and stuff like that, and so Broadrick kind of knew it was time to pursue his side project Fall Because full time, and then they just decided to change the name of Fall Because to Godflesh essentially. So and Fall Because is a title from a Killing Joke song. So I mean, again, you can kind of already start to see where the roots of Broadrick's mind are. He's definitely getting out of the speedier grind stuff and immediately kind of becoming interested in Swans and Killing Joke and some of the, I guess, deconstructive, industrialized, things.
Well, and even if you look at the,
Throbbing Grizzle is another big influence on Godflesh as well.
First side of Scum almost has that kind of more of that kind of sonic quality to it, but it's out of musical desperation and recording issues, I think. Yeah. But you can kind of hear it. It's not a huge leap, I don't think, to see first side of Scum and then to see where he goes with All Because and Godflesh.
And I think the way that they approach industrial metal, industrial metal is a weird genre in itself. I mean, very few bands have been successful with it. Some have kind of tasted minor success, like a Frontline Assembly or something like that, or even Skinny Puppy or whatever.
Fear Factory to some extent.
Well, Fear Factory, I think, is and Godflesh are probably the two that have been the most successful.
On the first
in the forefront,
Pitch Shifter records, I think.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Pitch Shifter. Yeah.
I think most people know them for their later on Garbage.
The Garbage, but yeah, Industrial, and then what was the EP? I have it, and it escapes me right now.
Jesus, I don't remember.
But they're both on, both early Earache recordings, and definitely get your hands on those. But the other band, in the 2000s is Red Harvest, but they're kind of...
even Thorns to some degree.
Has industrial element. I hear a lot of Godflesh influence on maybe what, Snorri was trying to do with Thorns and stuff, but... Godflesh's approach was different. Fear Factory was like more traditionally metal, and Godflesh was again like trying to create like soundscapes almost in a way. And the most straightforward thing that Godflesh really puts out in terms of like straight metal is Streetcleaner, which is their sort of their masterpiece. And it's odd to me that this hasn't shown up as a Hall of Fame yet, unless it's something with these two guys don't want to like talk anymore. You know what I mean?
Who knows? Yeah.
Like to me, it seems like a very obvious Hall of Fame choice for Decibel to do. Because it's had a pretty dramatic impact on ISIS and Neurosis and a lot of those kind of bands. But anyhow, and so of course he signed with Earache, and then Streetcleaner is written and released in 1989, and this will sort of go on to be sort of the masterpiece, I guess. And I guess this is the centerpiece of the show that we're going to do. And Mark doesn't really know what we're playing yet. I've sort of told him that we'll be
the next set
play
I kind of know, but after that
it's all a mystery for kind of like the punk show was, I guess, for you, where you're sort of but anyways, Godflesh I think is more appreciated now than maybe they were back then, because I think a lot of people, and I'm sure you and Chris to some extent, were sort of miffed by some of the choices that they were making in terms of like from album to album.
Yeah. Well, they lost me pretty quick.
Yeah. And I think, in the same way that like maybe Pyogenesis didn't lose you but lost so many other people, like I guess for some people, Godflesh was like your Pyogenesis or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In a sense, like.
But there were a huge crossover as well, and I mean between like people that didn't like metal at all.
Yeah.
But the people that were more into like the Jesus Lizard kind of stuff, like jumped onto Godflesh.
Sure, the AMREP crowd kind of I think could really find something about the noisiness of what Godflesh was doing, and just the fact that their lyrics weren't about devil worship and different things. I mean, they're still coming out of like the
it was more like a bros kind of. Approach
or something like that, and even the cover to Streetcleaner is so iconic with the sort of burning crosses and stuff. And I was telling Mark it comes from a Ken Russell film called Altered States with
it's on Netflix streaming. Yeah, you can find it on DVD for like $1.
Yeah,
I've seen it a couple times, but I don't really remember that. I don't remember that scene.
That particular scene, and then some of the stuff in the inside in terms of the layout was from Lynch's Eraserhead, so which is another pretty. I mean, I could almost see Justin Broadrick writing almost David Lynch music in a certain sense.
Yeah, those that age. I mean, he was probably early 20s, maybe. Yeah. At this point, and I can see how that would really affect those movies.
For sure. Yeah,
because those are kind of the gate. Well, not necessarily Altered States, but Eraserhead's kind of like the gateway cult movie for a lot of people, at least from our
well, and that's I was gonna say that's the kind of stuff like you and I were renting in early college, when we were hanging out, like Well,
I saw it in high school, but I knew a bunch of weird girls, so
yeah. And but in terms of aesthetics and things like that, and the sonic quality, I don't think you're gonna get a better album than Streetcleaner in terms of the industrial metal kind of sound. Mm-hmm. I think Pitch Shifter Industrial would probably be a very close second, and maybe third, but in a way different way, would be Demanufactured from Fear Factory or Psalm 69 from Ministry. I mean, they're sort of right on the front lines of these like just minor different approaches to stuff. And even Downward Spiral from Nine Inch Nails, for what it is, you love them or hate them because they're a pretty divisive band. In terms of how it was constructed sonically, is a pretty interesting.
Well, bringing the guitars back to the forefront.
Sure. So, but we're gonna hear kind of the ultimate expression, I guess, from Godflesh, which is Like Rats. Pretty straight, you breathe like rats, Christ Bait Rising, which is probably the heaviest song on Streetcleaner, and then Pulp. And I have a fond memory of these trio of tunes because they were all, as I've mentioned on several shows before, they were all in that little Grind Crusher sampler cassette tape that I picked up used as a sophomore in high school, along with Morbid Angel and the Entombed Left Hand Path trio of songs and the Carcass Reek stuff. So, and then we're going to end with a song that's going to start to take Godflesh in a much different direction, called Slavestate, which I'll have to play for Mark and see what his thoughts are on it at this point. So enjoy a trio from Streetcleaner, Like Rats, Christ Bait Rising, Pulp, and Slavestate. That was Slavestate, Pulp, Christbait Rising, and Like Rats from Godflesh there. And that last tune, Slavestate, kind of a grand departure for Godflesh in a way, in terms of introducing some of the techno, more mechanical dance elements, if you will, you know.
But then just before it gets a little bit too dancey, then they crush you with a riff.
Yeah, exactly. It comes back in. You know, I know you said that this is probably probably where you and Chris kind of got lost in Godflesh. I mean, well, I
was
guess
just got interested in other things.
What was the reaction, I guess, to this record when it came out, the Slavestate? I mean, was it?
I think it was received fairly well. I wasn't as interested in that stuff than the other stuff that was going on in the scene at the time, I think.
Gotcha. And it's funny, because now I think you look at a record like this and it makes more sense than probably back in, 91 when they put it out.
Yeah, I think they've always been a little ahead of the time,
sure.
Ahead of the curve.
Sure. And even the stuff you heard in the previous song, Pulp, which was more like, I mean, that had like this almost the pounding percussion. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really sounded like, even more so than the stuff we heard like on Godhead and things like that. The way that the drum machine was sort of working, it sounded like, gears sort of,
Was that the one that has like almost a typewriter sound?
Yeah, almost the typewriter percussion, And you hear stuff like that, like the Melvins, I was joking, did stuff like that on Houdini and things. And so, I mean, Godflesh has touched so many different bands, in terms of influence, Ministry, Fear Factory, the whole industrial metal scene, even Red Harvest has obviously used a lot from them. But, I mean, unfortunately, they've had some sort of side effects on some of the new metal stuff. I mean, Korn, in a way, really took their bass sound from Godflesh. But, and I know, like, guys like Alex Lifeson from Fudge Tunnel and even, like, Max, when they put together Napalm, they were very influenced by some of the sounds that Godflesh was sort of creating, and they used that for
they were really, I mean, they weren't
record.
pushing the envelope on sonic kind of barbarity, if anything. They were not necessarily pushing the metal envelope, but just like what you could really do with noise, with sound.
And I think that makes a lot more sense now, because I think probably back when you were into the scene, I mean, for the most part, metal was still fairly genreified. I mean, this is when like if a lot of people, if you were like a diehard black metal guy, you had to hate death metal or something. Like some of those sort of weird conventions were still going on in like 91, 92.
And it's still going on now too.
Yeah, to some extent. Although I'd like to believe that there's more of a Renaissance spirit, to metal where, and maybe that's just because like guys like you and I have always sort of, I guess, had that at least since the late 90s, where we kind of have embraced, whatever Catatonia or Anathema or Bride's doing in Paradise Lost, along with whatever Dark Throne and, Emperor and Death and, whatever, not obituary, but obituary up to like, Incomplete World Demise we are kind of interested in. But do you know what I mean? Like, we could go 1 week to a mono show and the next week to a Satyricon show. And like, to me, there's like not really any kind of difference in any of that sort of stuff, what I mean? So I guess like Godflesh was sort of, like focusing to that kind of audience. It's just the audience maybe wasn't there, or at least we weren't old enough to be that audience.
Well, it's almost, it seems like they were kind of that suffered from the same thing as Anathema. They're on this label that's known for grindcore and metal.
Sure. And
throwing this kind of oddball. I mean, there's also like Old Lady Drivers that was on Eric at the same time that was completely oddball.
Oh yeah,
as well. I don't know if you remember them or not.
Yeah. I do. Well, and even Pitch Shifter, was on Earache, but then Pitch Shifter after like the first couple of records sort of went into like a more poppy industrial kind of sound.
Yeah, like almost like
or something like that.
They almost kind of followed like the whole like Prodigy.
Yeah,
kind of
Marilyn Manson and some of that kind of stuff. So it's weird, and the next song we're going to play, which is another tune off of Slavestate, which again, Slavestate was put out in 91. It was actually originally intended to be 2 EPs, but Earache didn't want to release it as 2 EPs, and so they made Godflesh kind of put it together as one record. But a lot of remixes and different things on here, so it was a pretty experimental record. But the tune we just heard, Slavestate, and then the song we're going to hear next, especially, which is called Perfect Skin, this really sort of sets up the Isis, Neurosis, Pelican kind of soundscape, atmospheric, almost bringing in some of the shoegaze elements, which are so prevalent today with what Jesu or however you want to pronounce it, which that's coming out of like almost a Slow Dive, My Bloody Valentine meets Godflesh. Whereas
this stuff seems like it's more. There's more layers instead of just like basically relying on guitar, bass, and drums and this dissonant noise and feedback and stuff like that. Seems like a conscious layering, more so in this later on stuff.
Yep. And I guess like going back to we touched on Southern Lord before, but I think a band we didn't mention was Sun. You know, I mean, Sun probably took an incredible amount of influence, and I'm sure, you know, guys like Greg Anderson and O'Malley and those guys were probably huge Godflesh fans, but then they probably wanted to take it to this whole like new level of, you know, ambience and severity. Yeah, exactly. So, but the tune we got geared up is Perfect Skin, and from there, you know, we're gonna get into their I guess their second, I guess, focused full length. You know, I guess I don't see Slavestate as like a total full length, just because it's full of so many remixes and different things like that. It seems like an odd second album, you know, whereas Pure to me sounds like more of a sequel to Streetcleaner in a certain sense, even though it's bringing in some of the techno elements and some of the, I guess, the more experimental electronic elements you start to hear on Slavestate. You know, I guess when you hear this stuff like now, is it different than when you heard it back in the day? I mean, does it fit into more of a schema more now than, say, back when you were, you know, just coming out of high school?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes more sense in the context of listening to music for the last, you know, 15 years or whatever.
Yeah.
How all this stuff is kind of like what scenes it spawned, what it's been linked to and whatnot. I think just back in the day, I was just done with that era.
It wasn't your taste, yeah. You know, and I feel the same way with some things that I've kind of gone back and been like, why wasn't I listening to this before? Or why didn't this make sense?
But then it's good to bring it back into rotation now, because, like, you know, there's a ton of cool stuff out there, but it's always nice to go back and rediscover a lot of these old, you know, kind of like,
it is kind of cool that
genre-defying things.
Yeah, you know, we can, you know, like stuff that maybe we skipped past back in the day. You know, we can go back and kind of like
like Suffocation and stuff. Like, why the hell didn't I ever listen to that?
Yeah, well, even like, I mean, even to some extent, what we talked about with the Cannibal Show a couple months back. You know, I mean, like, I liked a few, you know, kind of Cannibal songs here and there mixed in, but I never would have considered myself like a fan of like their early era per se. You know, people like us who are kind of into the European thing were kind of above Cannibal in a certain sense or whatever. At least that's how we.
Well, they were associated with certain groups of people in our area, at least that, you know, the meat-headed kind of death metal people that just wanted to mosh.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, bands like Pantera brought, you know, that out. That brought the worst out in people too, and it's like once you separate yourself from that sometimes and then go back and listen to it without the contextual, like whatever was attached to that, some of that stuff holds up pretty well. You know, I mean, those first the trio, the first three, I guess, you know, hard Pantera records, not their glam 80s era stuff that people like to roll out sometimes, but those hold up pretty well too. And I think Godflesh is a band, as I go back and revisit it each time, you know, it makes more sense to me, I guess, now, you know, than when, you know, it was kind of being rolled out, because I really listened to Streetcleaner a lot. I had Slavestate and I had Pure, but I didn't really listen to them much because I didn't really know how to, like, get into the records at all. You know,
I think after listening to, like, jazz and more experimental music, it makes it kind of, like, rewires your brain how to listen to things a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this stuff makes a lot more sense than when you're trying to pull out, you know, typical or stereotypical like song structures where they don't exist in the stuff.
Well, I think the other thing that's tough when you're 18 or 19, I mean, typically, you know, you tend to be more of a social animal on you know, I mean, unless you're a complete like misanthrope or, you know, something like that. But, you know, it was hard to put on like a Godflesh record like Pure, you know, and like listen to it in the car with your friends as you're driving around.
It's not car music. This is more like, you know, indulging in some drugs and hanging out on the couch kind of music.
It's headphone music to some extent, you know, and so because I wasn't doing a lot of, you know, drugs or, you know, just sitting around, you know, like in a kind of neutral position, I don't think I had any context to listen to like Pure and Slavestate and some of that stuff. Whereas like Streetcleaner, you can pop on a song like, you know, Like Rats and kind of headbang to it as you're driving around with your buddies. You know, like you could do that, you know. Although this, you know, you listen to the tune like we just heard, Slavestate, and it's got some beats to it, so, you know, maybe you can get some girls dancing to it or something. I don't know, but you know, and you don't really get back to like, I guess, traditional song structure until really the Merciless EP and Selfless, which was their Columbia debuts, and we'll talk about those at the end of the show, I guess. But anyhow, so let's kind of continue on the trajectory. We're going to hear Perfect Skin, which is sort of a longer tune, which takes a while to sort of unwrap itself. It's definitely a antecedent of Isis, Pelican, Mono, Mogwai, you know, some of those kind of, you know, droning kind of the Neurisis bands, if you will, Cult of Luna, stuff like that. And then we're going to go into a pair of tunes from Pure, Predominance, which we
has
both
a little
noticed.
Man in the Box riff there.
Yeah, a little Alice in Chains without the wah-wah put at the end of it. And instead what they put at the end of it, I wrote down, is kind of the... it's the same sort of sonic quality that you hear in like a Solemn 69 NWO riff or a Napalm Point Blank Gorillaz kind of riff. It has this sort of like resonance at the very end of the riff that's kind of cool. And also you start to hear Justin experiment some sort of vocal effects and things, which he's going to do throughout the trajectory of Godflesh, but you really hear it pretty prominently here. And then we're going to end with Pure, this set, and you hear a little hip-hop sample from Eric B. and Rakim's Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I'm a big Paid in Full fan myself. I actually own a copy, so enjoy Perfect Skin, Predominance, and Pure. You just heard the hip-hop beats of Pure, Predominance, and Perfect Skin. And those last two, as I said, were off the aforementioned Pure. And
well, now we're going to bum you out a little bit.
A little bit. Godflesh is going to make a pretty interesting transition here, as are all the earache bands. And we haven't talked a tremendous amount about this, because I don't know if we've actually done this era except for Carcass. I think Carcass is the only band that we've done so far that's been affected by the Columbia earache thing.
We talked about Cathedral a little bit.
Cathedral a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah, because we haven't done the Napalm show, and we haven't done some of the other bands. Oh, the Entombed, Wolverine Blues. We haven't done that era of Entombed yet either.
Yeah, we've only done Left Hand Path.
But yeah, Godflesh will be one of those bands, and I think there was reasonable cause to believe that Godflesh could have actually been a fairly popular band in a certain sense, especially with some of the things that they do on Merciless and Selfless. But I think that they were a little bit ahead of their time. I think if they had put these records out in the midst of sort of when Korn and the Deftones and some of that stuff, the more, the metal music that got big in the late 90s, that was devoid of solos, devoid of it was just more like they were just making noise and singing over it. Not that I want to even put Korn and some of that stuff in the same light as Godflesh, but in a way, Korn took the sort of really like highbrow intellectual approach that Godflesh was taking, and they just sort of like lowest common denominator. They
SoCal'd it, man.
Yeah. What's that?
They SoCal'd it.
Yeah, there you go. They SoCal'd it with Adidas pants and all. So
I like Adidas shoes, but that's about it.
Yeah. I was going to tell you a story that I just read about today, but I'm not going to. But yeah, so the first thing that when Earache signs its sort of notorious contract with Columbia to release, was it 6 or 7 bands through the Columbia label?
Yeah,
it was like 7. A Fudge Tunnel was thrown in that as well. But the first thing that they put out...
Pitch Shifter.
Pitch Shifter was on there too, I forgot. But by that point, was Pitch Shifter even making anything that was worth listening to?
They did a decent record. The first one out. And then after that, it started going down the toilet.
See, I
because actually Pitch Shifter toured with Carcass on the Heartwork tour.
Oh, really? So they were still making decent stuff then. I'm trying to think what was out.
Actually, that might have been the state at which they went to. I know you don't like that record either.
She's getting Merciless on us, and the Merciless EP is what they put out first, and it was a 4-song EP, and they do 2 original songs on it, one type of remix thing, and then the remix that we're going to play, which is the Flowers remix, which is a remix of a song called Don't Bring Me the Flowers from Pure. And that's what we're going to end the show with tonight, is a pair of songs from Merciless. Godflesh obviously will continue on beyond this with Selfless, which is a record that either I want to play a couple tunes from it or just ignore it. It's one of those things. It's not really worth sort of just tapping into one song, and just based on the length of songs that Godflesh has on these previous songs we played, we really don't have room for it. So maybe someday down the road we can kind of do the forgotten Godflesh era, which supposedly stuff like hymns and stuff.
Hate and Dub.
Yeah, we won't play anything off that probably, but supposedly stuff like hymns, which I'm not that familiar with, as are you, is supposed to be a pretty decent record. But it was just, we were so far out of Godflesh at that point, I wouldn't have paid attention to it. So,
even on Merciless here, we can kind of see where the whole Jesu track comes from. It's a pretty logical extension, but it took 10 years?
Yeah, something. Yeah. And this first tune, the title track, Merciless, is just like a very, it's predictive of Selfless, which was I guess more straightforward rock and roll songs, but done with like a Godflesh sensibility, less dissonant in a way, at least Merciless and the Selfless full length that follows, but definitely more focused, more repetitive in a certain sense, not in the industrial repetitive, but repetitive in like the verse chorus kind of sense of things. So, and then Flowers is just like utterly it's beautiful, like the way that Jesu is, and shoegazy in a certain sense.
But it's bleak. It's really
very bleak. I mean, you get to the end of the song and the end of the show, and I told Mark, I'm like, hell of a show closer, eh? And Mark kind of put 2 gun barrels to his head, fake gun barrels, and sort of.
I always carry, I'm an NRA member, so
always carrying a barrage of firearms with you wherever you go.
Of course.
So,
what's more metal than that?
Exactly. It's like the Arcturus record where Garm's pointing a gun and different things. So, oh wow, look at that. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Sure.
I was just showing my fake NRA card.
Yeah, is it a fake? Where'd you get that from?
They just sent it to me in the mail.
Oh, nice. So you just carry it around, pretend
It's got my name on it. Yeah, it gets me all the privileges that the card
all the
allows.
perks. Yeah, so you can hang out with more white people.
Yeah, you get your Charlton Heston teeth and all the other kinds of cool stuff.
Awesome. Well, let us know what you thought of this era of Godflesh. I mean, they're a very divisive band. Maybe they're a band you ignored at a certain point, or maybe you, like Mark, kind of deviated away when Slavestate and some of this stuff came out. So shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what your thoughts are. Leave us feedback on iTunes or on
the site itself.
Yeah, requiempodcast.com, where you can get mugs and some of Mark's decibel artwork and different things like that.
All kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, so
if you'd like to help us out with operating costs, the economy's hitting us hard.
There's a
donate button, which would, we always appreciate any donation we get.
We appreciate that. So, but we hope you've enjoyed your time in the bleak world of Justin Broadrick's mind with Godflesh, and so we're going to end things tonight with Merciless and Flowers. So for Requiem Podcast, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.